From the academy to the command post, the Weekend Wrap-Up podcast covers the leadership lessons, mentorship, and tough conversations needed to build a resilient firehouse. Rated as one of the best fire and emergency services podcasts, get ready to be empowered by host Kevin Ferrara as he presents another informative episode you won't want to miss. Get ready, folks. Here we go.
Welcome, everybody. You're listening to AFSO 21's Weekend Wrap-Up podcast. Here is your host, Kevin Ferrara.
If you live in a major city, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and you smell smoke, dial 911. Within minutes, a massive multi-million-dollar apparatus pulls out of the station and is on its way to your front door. Those stepping off that truck, well, they're career professionals. It's their full-time job. They're highly paid, highly trained, and they're always there. But if you live in areas that make up roughly 70% of the United States, that's not what happens. If you live in rural township Pennsylvania, a farming community in Iowa, or a mountain village in Colorado, and your house catches fire, say at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, well, that 911 call goes out to a pager or a cell phone sitting on a nightstand. It wakes up a mechanic, a school teacher, a local farmer, or maybe a retired grandfather. Those individuals have to jump out of bed, throw on some clothes, drive their personal vehicle to the local firehouse, and then wait for enough of their neighbors to show up to safely crew a truck, and then drive to your house. Now, some firefighters, they may drive directly to the scene, but they're going to find themselves waiting for the fire trucks to arrive. That's what the volunteer fire service is today. It's the backbone of an American emergency response. But right now, at this very moment, that backbone is fracturing. Welcome everyone to AFSO 21's Weekend Wrap-Up podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Ferrara, and in this episode, we're looking at a quiet, creeping crisis that's unfolding across the rural landscape of this country. It's a crisis that doesn't make the national nightly news until, well, it's too late. The volunteer fire service, folks, hits on life support. While the tones are dropping more and more, fewer and fewer people are responding. We're going to dissect exactly how we got here. We'll look at the brutal mathematics of recruitment and retention, the crushing weight of modern training requirements, the financial black hole that rural departments are forced to navigate, and the sociological shift in how we view community. Most importantly, we aren't just here to admire the problem. We're going to talk about what must be done to ensure that the millions of citizens living in rural communities aren't left entirely unprotected. So pull up a chair. This is going to be an honest, uncomfortable, but absolutely vital conversation. So let's start with some raw numbers to ground us. According to FEMA, of the 21,117 registered fire departments today, there's roughly 1.2 million firefighters in the United States. Of those firefighters, about 87%, well, they're volunteers or paid per call. So let that sink in. Over 3/4 of the personnel defending this nation from fire and medical emergencies, well, they do it for free or for very little money. In terms of sheer geography, volunteer fire departments protect the vast majority of the U.S. landmass. And we're talking about small towns, agricultural hubs, critical infrastructure, interstate highways, and wildland-urban interfaces. And what is the economic value of this? Well, research shows that the volunteer fire service saves U.S. taxpayers an estimated $47 billion annually. So if every small town suddenly had to pay a full-time career staff, you can guarantee local property taxes in rural America would skyrocket to levels that would utterly bankrupt those communities. For generations, this system worked on a simple social contract, neighbor helping neighbor. When the siren on top of the town hall went off, the town paused. Employers let workers walk off the job to go fight a fire. It was a matter of civic pride. But that contract, well, it's expired. Since the 1980s, the number of volunteer firefighters in the U.S. has plummeted by tens of thousands, while the number of emergency calls has more than tripled. We have fewer people doing vastly more work. In the fire service, we talk about the turnout time, the time it takes from the dispatch to the truck rolling out the bay doors. In many rural areas today, that time is stretching from a few minutes to, well, maybe 10, 15, how about 20 minutes? Could be longer. Sometimes a department has to fail to respond entirely, forcing the dispatcher to maybe call a neighboring town 12 miles away. So think about your own home for a second. Modern houses don't burn like old houses. Legacy homes built in the 50s took roughly 15 to 17 minutes to reach flashover. That's the point where everything in the room ignites and survival becomes, well, almost impossible. Today's homes, well, they're built with synthetic materials, engineered lumber, polyurethane-filled furniture. These homes today, well, they reach flashover in under 3 to 5 minutes. So if it takes 20 minutes for a volunteer crew to arrive, they're not saving your house. They're merely stopping the fire from spreading to maybe your neighbor's house. And as some fire departments say, well, they're saving the foundation. Folks, the system in place today, it's failing. And to fix it, we have to understand the specific suffocating pressures that are killing it. To understand why volunteerism is dying, we have to look at the intersection of three massive societal shifts: demographics, economics, and time. So let's break these down one by one because they form a triple threat that rural departments are utterly under-equipped to fight. First, let's talk about demographics. The demographic landscape of rural America has fundamentally changed over the last 40 years. There's a phenomenon sociologists call the rural brain drain. For decades, small towns have seen their youth graduate high school and immediately leave for urban centers or major suburbs in search of higher education and white-collar jobs. The manufacturing plants, the family farms, the local mills, the economic engines that used to anchor young adults to their hometowns, well, they've shrunk or vanished entirely. So who's left behind? Well, an aging population. If you walk into a typical rural volunteer fire department meeting tonight, you'll see a room full of gray hair. The average age of the American volunteer firefighter is steadily creeping into the late 40s, 50s, even 60s. And I've spoken to chiefs who tell me their primary driver on the daytime shift, well, they're about averaging 72 years of age. Now, bless these individuals. Their dedication, it's heroic, but firefighting is a brutally punishing physical job. Crawling through a smoke-filled hallway carrying 75 pounds of gear, dragging a charged 1 3/4 hose line, maybe swinging a sledgehammer or an axe, this is an athlete's game. When your entire operational workforce is eligible for AARP benefits, you're living on borrowed time. And it's not just that the youth are leaving. It's that the people moving into these rural areas, often commuters looking for cheaper housing or retirees looking for peace, well, they don't have deep roots in the community. They often don't even realize the fire department is volunteer. They see a red truck in a nice brick building and assume their tax dollars are paying for a professional staff. There's a profound lack of awareness, which this brings us to the second pressure, economics. In the mid-20th century, a volunteer firefighter often worked within a 5-mile radius of the fire station. They worked at the local hardware store, the bank, the auto repair shop, or the family farm. If a major fire broke out at 10 a.m., the business owner understood that letting their employee leave was part of the cost of living in a safe community. However, today, rural economies are largely bedroom communities. People don't work where they live. They get up at 5:30 a.m., hop on the highway, maybe commute 40, 45 minutes, often an hour, into a metro area for work. Folks, if you're an hour away at your corporate job, you can't respond to a fire call in your hometown. Even if you're close by, modern corporate culture, well, it's not friendly to the volunteer firefighter. In an era of hyper productivity, lean staffing, rigid corporate metrics, very few managers are going to smile when you say, "Hey, I have to skip this client meeting because a barn's on fire down the road." Furthermore, the economic strain on families means that people are working multiple jobs just to stay afloat. If you're working a 50-hour work week across 2 jobs and you have kids, where do you find the hours to give to the fire department? And that leads us directly into the third and perhaps most insidious killer of the volunteer fire service: the crushing burden of time and training. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a 25-year-old citizen who wants to do something good for their community. They walk into their local fire station and say, "Hey, I want to be a volunteer firefighter." 40 years ago, the chief would hand you a coat, pair of boots, and a helmet, show you how to start the pump, tell you to stay behind the older guys, and say, "Welcome to the department." Was that safe? Not always, but it was accessible. Today, the standards set by agencies like NFPA and OSHA, well, they're rigorous, and for good reason. Fire behaves differently now, and we know more about line-of-duty deaths and cancer risks than ever before. To become a basic interior firefighter today, you typically need to complete a course called Firefighter 1 or Essentials of Firefighting. Depending on the state, that course is anywhere between 150, 200 hours of training. Think about that, 200 hours. If you have a full-time job and a family, and you attend class maybe 2 nights a week and every Saturday, it's going to take months to complete. And that's just to get your foot in the door. If your department also handles EMS, which most do, you're going to need an additional 150, maybe 200 hours for an EMT certification. So before a volunteer can even legally step onto a fire scene to help their neighbors, they're looking at nearly 400 hours of intense, physically exhausting, emotionally taxing training. And what happens once they pass? Well, the bureaucracy doesn't stop. There's those monthly meetings, mandatory equipment maintenance, continuing education hours, fundraising events, and bloodborne pathogen refreshers. The modern volunteer fire department has transitioned from a civic club into a highly regulated, uncompensated corporation. We're asking people to professionalize their hobby to a degree that rivals full-time employment. But we are paying them $0 an hour. Is it any wonder the recruitment lines are empty? If the human cost of volunteering hasn't shocked you, let's talk about the money, because this is where the crisis moves from sad to outright absurd. So I want you to imagine a municipal police department. Imagine the police chief walking down Main Street, setting up a folding table, and selling pulled pork sandwiches or raffle tickets so they can buy ammunition for their service weapons or fuel for their cruisers. Sounds laughable, doesn't it? We would never expect our law enforcement officers to fundraise for basic survival. We view policing as an essential public utility, fully funded by tax revenues. Yet, right now, in thousands of communities across this country, that's exactly how the fire department operates. They're running fish fries, chicken barbecues, bingo nights, pancake breakfasts just to pay the electric bill at the station and keep diesel in the trucks. The bake sale model of public safety, it's a catastrophic failure, and here's why. The cost of firefighting equipment has outpaced inflation at a terrifying rate. So let's look at the numbers. A single set of structural firefighting turnout gear, the coat, the pants, boots, gloves, hood, and helmet, may cost anywhere between $4,000 and $6,000, depending on how the department configures what they want for their members. But it doesn't stop there. Firefighter can't breathe inside a burning building without a self-contained breathing apparatus. So that single SCBA unit with the harness, the mask, the air cylinders, well, those are costing anywhere between $8,000 and maybe $12,000. Again, depending on which manufacturer the department goes with. So before a single human being steps onto a fire truck, The department has to spend roughly $15,000 just to outfit them safely. And according to NFPA standards, that turnout gear has an expiration date. Even if it's never seen a fire, even if it's sat in a locker room for 10 years, it must be retired and replaced after a decade due to material degradation. Sorry, I can't talk tonight. So let's transition over to the fire trucks. In 2000, a standard no-frills fire engine may have cost anywhere between $250,000 to $300,000. Today, in 2026, that standard pumper may start out at about $800,000, easily push past $1 million. If you need a ladder truck or an aerial platform, well, guess what? You're looking at anywhere between $1.5 and maybe $2 million. On top of that, supply chain issues mean that if a volunteer department manages to secure the funding for a new truck today, the timeline, well, it's averaging 3 to 4 years. So think about a small rural township with a tax base of 2,000 residents. How many chicken dinners do you have to sell to buy a $1 million piece of apparatus? The math is impossible. It's completely decoupled from reality. So how do these departments survive? Well, many often they rely on grants. The federal government offers programs like the Assistance to Firefighters Grant or the SAFER, the Staffing for Adequate Fire and Emergency Response Grants. But these grants, well, they're a lottery system. Thousands of departments across the country apply, and only a fraction receive funding. Writing these grants, well, that's a highly technical skill. Large career departments, they have dedicated grant writers on staff. But that volunteer fire chief who just finished a 10-hour shift on his day job, well, he or she may be sitting at a kitchen table at midnight trying to navigate federal grant portals against professional writers. So who do you think is going to win that lottery? The departments that need the help the most, well, they're often the ones least capable of navigating the bureaucratic maze required to get it. And what happens when the money runs out? Well, obviously the trucks get older. They break down. I've visited departments where the primary response engine is 20, 25, 30 years old. The brakes are failing, parts are obsolete, and the safety features like enclosed cabs and airbags, well, some of them are non-existent. Folks, we're putting our volunteers into outdated, potentially unsafe apparatus because we refuse to fund them properly. And this is a national disgrace. We've talked about the time, the demographics, and the money. But now we need to look at the human being inside the gear, because the psychological and physical landscape of modern emergency response is vastly more toxic than it was for previous generations. When people think of the fire department, well, they think of fire. They think of pulling cats out of trees and putting out burning buildings. But the reality is the modern fire service is actually an EMS service that occasionally handles fires. In fact, over 70 to 80% of all emergency calls nationwide are now medical. In rural America, this problem is magnified by the healthcare crisis. Rural hospitals are closing at an alarming rate. When a local hospital shuts down, the volunteer ambulance service becomes the default healthcare provider for the region. If an elderly citizen has a chronic medical issue, they don't have a clinic down the street anymore. They dial 911. This means that a volunteer firefighter isn't just dealing with the occasional adrenaline rush of a structure fire. They're now responding to diabetic shocks, cardiac arrests, drug overdoses, and severe psychiatric crises. And in a small town, there's a psychological weight that career firefighters in big cities rarely have to carry. You know, the victims. When a career firefighter in Chicago responds to a fatal car accident on the expressway, it's a tragedy, but it's an anonymous tragedy. But when a volunteer firefighter in a town of 1,500 responds to a head-on collision on the state highway, there's a very high probability that the person trapped in that vehicle is their high school classmate, their neighbor, their Sunday school teacher, or their own cousin. The trauma is intimate. It's hyperlocal. For decades, the culture of the fire service was one of endurance. You saw something horrific, you washed the blood off the truck, you went back to the station, maybe drank a cup of coffee, and you didn't talk about it. We're paying the price for that culture today. Post-traumatic stress injury and suicide rates among firefighters, well, they've skyrocketed. Statistically, a firefighter is more likely to die by suicide than in the line of duty. For a volunteer who goes straight from a horrific fatal accident scene back to their cubicle or their farm without any psychological decompression or peer support, well, that isolation, that can be lethal. And then there's the physical killer, cancer. Firefighters are dying of cancer at rates vastly higher than the general public. The synthetic materials burning in modern homes releases a toxic cocktail of carcinogens, cyanide, benzene, formaldehyde, and these toxins embed themselves in the turnout gear and absorb through the skin. Furthermore, the very foam used to put out fires for decades contains PFAS, so-called forever chemicals, that are directly linked to organ cancers. So, let's look at the value proposition we're offering to a modern citizen. Give us 400 hours of your free time for training, buy your own gas to get to the station, spend your weekends fundraising, respond to calls where you'll see your neighbors at the worst moments of their lives, and oh, by the way, you'll be exposed to toxins that significantly increase your risk of terminal cancer. And all of this for $0. When you phrase it honestly, it's not surprising that recruitment is down. What is surprising is that anyone is still showing up at all. The people who are still doing this, well, they're saints. But we can't run a national public safety infrastructure on sainthood alone. Up to this point, we've diagnosed a terminal illness. The volunteer fire service is on life support. The trajectory we're on leads to a dark place, a place where response times in rural America stretch past 30 minutes, where property losses double, and where preventable deaths become a daily reality. So, how do we fix it? What's the roadmap to survival? It won't be fixed by a slick recruitment video or a new billboard on the highway. It requires a fundamental, systemic overhaul of how we fund, train, and value rural emergency services. And here are some critical levers we must pull immediately. First and foremost, we must legally and culturally retire the fundraising model of public safety. State legislators across this country need to pass laws that making the funding of fire protection mandatory for local governments, just like policing and education. Every county or municipality should be divided into funded fire protection districts. If you live in a rural area, you should pay a dedicated, transparent fire tax. It doesn't have to be massive, but it must be enough to ensure that the local department has a guaranteed, predictable revenue stream to buy gear and replace trucks without flipping a single pancake. Public safety is an essential utility. It's time we fund it like one. And we have to accept that pure volunteerism is no longer viable in many areas during daytime hours. The solution? Well, it's the combination department. Rural municipalities must invest in hiring a small core of career staff, even just 2 or 3 full-time personnel, to cover the station Monday through Friday, maybe from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. These paid individuals ensure that when a call comes in during the workday, a truck rolls instantly. The volunteers then form the supplemental force for nights and weekends. This takes the immense pressure off the volunteers during their working hours and ensures the community is never left unprotected during the day. If we aren't going to pay volunteers an hourly wage, we must pay them through systemic incentives. And we could do this through tax relief, where every active volunteer firefighter should be completely exempt from local property taxes and state income taxes, period. May offer pensions. If we do, we need to expand length of service award programs. If you give 20 years of active service to a volunteer fire department, local or state officials should provide you with a guaranteed monthly pension check in your retirement. And then there's education incentives. Want to solve the youth recruitment problem? offer free tuition to state universities or community colleges for anyone who maintains active volunteer status at a local fire department. If you defend your community should fund your future. So we need to change how we train. We can't lower the standards of safety, but we can change the delivery. State training academies must embrace hybrid learning. All lecture components of Firefighter 1 and EMT, they should be available online so a volunteer can complete the classroom work at 10 p.m. in their living room. Furthermore, we need to create modular certifications. If someone only wants to drive the truck and operate the pump, let them certify quickly as a pump operator without forcing them to take 150 hours of structural crawling and ladder rescue training. Let people do the parts of the job they are available for. And finally, the federal government needs to step up in a massive way. We need a modern equivalent of the Montgomery GI Bill, or post 9/11 GI Bill as we see in the military, for volunteer emergency responders. The federal government should heavily subsidize the procurement of fire apparatus for rural areas, capping the cost or creating national buying pools to bypass corporate price gouging. If we can spend billions on international aid and massive infrastructure projects, we can afford to buy fire trucks for the heartland of America. So, as we wrap up this journey, I want to leave you with one final thought. The volunteer fire service is more than just a collection of trucks and tools. It's the ultimate manifestation of the American spirit. It's in its purest form of democracy in action, individuals stepping forward, risking their lives, sacrificing their health for no other reason than that their neighbor is in trouble. When we let a volunteer fire department die, we aren't just losing an emergency response asset. We're losing a piece of our social fabric. We're admitting that we no longer care enough about each other to stand in the gap. If you live in a community served by volunteers, I challenge you to do something tomorrow. Don't wait for your house to catch fire to meet your local firefighters. Look up your local department. Find out when their meeting night is. Go down there, walk through the door, and talk to them. You don't have to run into a burning building to help. They need mechanics. They need accountants to manage the books. They need people to wash the trucks, manage their website, or help with community outreach. And if you can't give your time, show up at the next municipal or county commissioner meeting. Ask the hard questions. Ask them how much they are investing in fire protection and emergency services. Demand that your local leaders stop treating your fire department and emergency services like a charity and start treating them like the vital life support systems they are. The thin red line is thinning out, folks, but it hasn't snapped yet. It's close, but it hasn't snapped yet. There's still time to fix this, but the clock is ticking and the tones are dropping. So with that, thanks for listening, and as always, stay safe.
Thanks for listening. To follow Kevin and the Weekend Wrap-Up podcast from your favorite streaming platform, open the podcast description and then click the Support the Show link, or go to afso21.com. From there, click the Weekend Wrap-Up podcast link, which will allow you to follow the show, download episodes, learn more about our contributors and the podcast, subscribe, which gives you exclusive access to premium and/or bonus episodes, or support the show, where you can make a much-appreciated contribution of your choice. You can even click on the podcasts we love to build your personal podcast library. We here at the Weekend Wrap-Up podcast appreciate you and look forward to bringing you more episodes that support the work you're doing in fire and emergency services. Remember, click the Support the Show link or head over to our website at afso21.com. Stay safe.